September 10th, 2007, 9:14 a.m. Dirksen United States Courthouse, Chicago, Illinois. The courtroom on the 24th floor of the federal building was silent in the way that only federal courtrooms can be silent. A compressed, anticipatory stillness, every breath held back by the weight of what was about to happen. United States District Judge James Zagel adjusted the papers on his bench. The jury had been deliberating for days. The gallery was packed. Reporters, federal agents, retired detectives who had spent careers trying to make cases that kept dissolving before they ever reached a courtroom. This case had taken 8 years to assemble. 8 years of undercover work, of surveillance, of a son sitting down across from his own father in a federal prison yard and letting a recording device run while confessions spilled out between them. The foreman stood. The charges were read. The verdicts landed one after another like stones dropping into still water. Racketeering conspiracy, extortion, loan sharking, murder for 5 defendants seated at the defense tables. Men who had spent decades inside one of the most feared and secretive criminal organizations in American history. It was over. The operation the FBI had named Operation Family Secrets had done what almost nothing before it had managed to do: crack open the Chicago outfit. To understand how a case like this gets built, you have to go back to where it began. Not to the courthouse and not to the prison yard where the wires were running, but to the streets of the Chicago neighborhoods where the outfit had operated since before most of the men in that courtroom were born. The Chicago outfit, the city's organized crime family with roots tracing to the Capone era, ran its operations through a rigid structure of crews, captains, and a leadership hierarchy that deliberately kept any single person from knowing too much. Violence was a tool of discipline and silence. Murders were ordered from above and carried out by trusted soldiers, and the chain insulating the bosses from the acts themselves was the entire architecture of the organization's longevity. For decades, federal prosecutors had tried to penetrate that architecture. The results, measured against the true scale of the outfit's operations, were modest. Pieces got prosecuted. Individuals went to prison. The organization itself endured. Frank Calabrese Sr. was one of the outfit's most reliable instruments of that violence. A South Side loan shark and reputed hitman known to associates as Frankie the Breeze, Calabrese had for years operated a crew that collected street debts through intimidation and, when intimidation failed, through worse. He was the kind of man whose reputation preceded him into every negotiation. A reputation built on what people in the organization knew he was willing to do. By the 1990s, federal investigators had gathered enough to charge him on racketeering counts connected to his loan sharking operation. He went to federal prison at Milan, Michigan. It was inside Milan that the investigation that would eventually become Operation Family Secrets began to take shape. And it began not with an FBI agent, but with a letter. Frank Calabrese Jr. had grown up inside the world his father controlled. He had worked for the crew. He had collected money, run errands, and been present for enough of his father's operations to understand exactly what the family business was. Prison didn't change his father. If anything, it concentrated the elder Calabrese. Removed from the daily pressures of running a crew on the street, he had time to talk, to reminisce, to instruct, and in the prison yard and the visiting areas of Milan Federal Correctional Institution, he talked to his son. He talked about murders. He talked about men he had killed. He provided details, circumstances, methods, the identities of victims and co-conspirators that had never appeared in any court record, that had never been spoken aloud in any investigation. Frank Calabrese Jr. made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wrote a letter to the FBI. The Bureau's Chicago field office had been watching the outfit for years. Special agents assigned to organized crime understood the difficulty of what they were attempting. The outfit's communication discipline, its insulation of leadership from criminal acts, the fear that kept witnesses silent even decades after crimes were committed. When the letter from Frank Jr. arrived, the agents who read it understood immediately what they were looking at. This was not a peripheral figure looking to trade minor information for a reduced sentence. This was a man with direct access to one of the outfit's known operatives, a man whose father apparently believed that the prison environment and the bonds of blood made him safe to speak freely. FBI special agents assigned to the case began the methodical work of verifying what Frank Jr. was offering. The murders he described, his father's involvement in them, the names of victims, the organizational context, were cross-referenced against the Bureau's own files, against cold case records from the Chicago Police Department, against the accumulated investigative history of decades of outfit surveillance. The information checked out. Again and again, the details Frank Jr. provided aligned with documented facts that had never been made public. The decision was made to wire Frank Jr. and put him back in front of his father. For more than 2 years, Frank Calabrese Jr. carried a recording device into the prison yard and visiting areas of Milan Federal Correctional Institution. The recordings that resulted were extraordinary by any measure in the history of American organized crime prosecution. Frank Calabrese Sr., believing himself to be speaking in confidence to his own son, provided detailed accounts of murders he had committed or participated in going back to 1970. He described methods. He named co-conspirators. He spoke about the chain of command, who had ordered certain killings, which captains had been informed, how the organization managed the logistics of violent acts that needed to be clean, untraceable, and deniable. Investigators listening to those recordings understood they were building something unprecedented, a case that used the outfit's own traditions of secrecy and insularity against itself. The hierarchy that protected bosses from criminal liability had depended on silence moving upward. Frank Jr. Itzer's recordings were making that silence visible for the first time. The investigation expanded. What had begun with a single cooperator's letter grew into a sprawling 8-year effort coordinated by the FBI Chicago Field Office in conjunction with federal prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. Investigators began tracing the thread of each murder Frank Sr. had described, identifying victims, matching timelines, locating surviving witnesses and family members who had never known what had happened to their relatives or why. 18 unsolved murders. That was the number investigators ultimately connected to the Chicago outfit through the evidence assembled during Operation Family Secrets. 18 killings dating back to 1970, many of them never publicly attributed to organized crime. Victims whose families had lived for decades without knowing who had been responsible. Cold cases that the Chicago Police Department had listed as open, cases where the leads had gone cold long ago, cases that existed in filing cabinets as unresolved questions, all of them coming into focus through the testimony of one man and the recordings he had made at incalculable personal risk. The indictment came down in 2005. 14 defendants were named. The charges encompassed racketeering conspiracy, extortion, loan sharking, and murder. The men named in the indictment represented a cross-section of the Chicago outfit's operational leadership, soldiers, captains, and the men who sat at the top of the organization's hierarchy. Among the 14 was James Marcello, known by the federal indictment and by those in the organization as Little Jimmy. Marcello's role in the Chicago outfit had been the subject of federal scrutiny for years. Investigators had long believed he occupied a position at or near the top of the organization's current leadership structure. What the indictment described as acting boss, putting that charge in front of a federal jury, required the kind of evidence that connected him not just to the organization's existence, but to its specific criminal acts, including the murders that were the centerpiece of the case. Operation Family Secrets provided that evidence. Joseph Lombardo was another name in the indictment that carried historical weight for anyone who had followed the Chicago outfit. Known as Joey the Clown, Lombardo had been a figure in organized crime circles since the 1960s. He had previously been prosecuted in connection with the Grey Lord scandal and other organized crime cases in the 1980s. His role, as described in the Operation Family Secrets indictment, was consigliere, the counselor, the advisor, the man whose position in the hierarchy required him to be consulted on major decisions, including decisions about violence. Lombardo had managed to evade capture when the indictment came down. He was, for a time, a fugitive, a man in his 70s, wanted on federal racketeering and murder charges, moving through the Chicago area while law enforcement searched for him. U.S. Marshals coordinated the manhunt. Tips came in. Surveillance was maintained at locations connected to associates. After several months, Lombardo was apprehended. He was brought back to face the charges in the indictment. He had fled. The trial began in 2007. It was a proceeding that drew sustained attention from both the federal law enforcement community and from reporters who had spent careers covering Chicago organized crime. The evidence presented included the prison recordings made by Frank Calabrese Jr., recordings in which his father described murders in his own voice, in his own words, with a specificity that left little room for the defense to argue ambiguity. Frank Jr. himself took the stand and testified about his years inside the outfit, about what he had witnessed and what he had heard and what had driven him to the decision to cooperate with the government. The defense attorneys argued what defense attorneys in organized crime cases always argue, that cooperators have incentives to lie, that recordings can be misinterpreted, that the government has constructed a narrative that distorts the evidence. Those arguments, in the context of what the jury heard and saw, were not sufficient. On September 10, 2007, after deliberations that the gathered press and law enforcement observers followed with close attention, the jury returned verdicts on 5 of the defendants. James Marcello was convicted on racketeering conspiracy charges. Joseph Lombardo was convicted on racketeering conspiracy charges. Frank Calabrese Sr., the man whose confessions in the prison yard had built the foundation of the case, the man whose own son had agreed to become the instrument of his undoing, was convicted as well. 2 other defendants, Nicholas Ferriola and Joseph Venezia, also received guilty verdicts on their respective charges. For the FBI's Chicago field office, the verdicts represented something larger than individual convictions. Operation Family Secrets had done what organized crime prosecution almost never manages to do. It had reached into the leadership of the organization, connected that leadership to specific acts of lethal violence dating back decades, and secured convictions on the evidence of those acts. The 18 murders at the center of the case, killings that had remained unsolved for years or decades, that victims' families had given up hope of seeing resolved, were finally attributed in a federal court to the men responsible for them. The sentencing came in early 2009. Judge James Zagel, who had presided over the trial with the kind of careful deliberateness that a case of this complexity demanded, considered the evidence, the advisory guidelines, and the arguments presented by prosecution and defense before imposing his sentences. For Frank Calabrese Sr., the man whose conversations in a Michigan prison yard had made the case possible and had made his own fate inevitable, Judge Zagel imposed a sentence of life in federal prison. The murders Calabrese had described in those recordings, the decades of loan sharking and violence and organizational service to a criminal enterprise, the totality of that record resulted in a sentence with no end. For Joseph Lombardo, the consigliere whose decades in the Chicago outfit's leadership had included his role in the conspiracy charged in the indictment, Judge Zagel also imposed a sentence of life in federal prison. Lombardo, who had been a figure in Chicago organized crime since the Kennedy administration, would not leave federal custody. James Marcello, convicted on the racketeering conspiracy charges that connected him to the outfit's leadership, received a sentence of life in prison as well. The FBI, in the aftermath of the sentencing, described Operation Family Secrets as one of the most successful organized crime investigations in the Bureau's history. That assessment reflected not just the convictions obtained, but the particular character of what the investigation had accomplished. Cold cases closed, families of murder victims who had waited for years, received the official acknowledgement of what had happened and who had been responsible. The Chicago outfit's leadership, the men who had sat at the top of an organization that had survived decades of federal scrutiny by maintaining the silence and insulation that made prosecution difficult, had finally been held accountable. But behind the legal architecture and the institutional language of the post-verdict press releases, the human story at the center of Operation Family Secrets remained the one that distinguished it from every other organized crime case in that era. Frank Calabrese Jr. had grown up inside his father's world. He had understood from childhood the nature of what his father was and what the organization his father served represented. He had worked for that organization, he had been shaped by it, and in the end, sitting in a federal prison and watching his father conduct what amounted to a tutorial in murder, he had made the decision that no one inside the outfit would have believed possible. He had written the letter. The FBI built the case from there. 8 years of investigative work, hundreds of interviews, painstaking matching of testimonial evidence to documented crime records, thousands of hours of surveillance and recording. Special agents from the Chicago field office coordinated with the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois through the entirety of that process, building a case whose scope required a level of sustained institutional commitment that tested the resources and patience of everyone involved. The prison recordings that Frank Jr. had made were the backbone of the prosecution, but the connective tissue, the corroboration, the victim identification, the witness development, the documentation, came from 8 years of methodical federal investigative work. The result was a trial that produced convictions on a racketeering conspiracy that reached the acting boss and consigliere of one of the country's most enduring criminal organizations. It produced life sentences for men who had, by every expectation of how the outfit operated, expected to die free. And it produced something rarer than any of that: closure, or at least the closest thing to it that a legal proceeding can provide. For the families of 18 murder victims whose cases had been open for as long as some of them had been alive, Operation Family Secrets closed in the way that the best federal organized crime investigations close, with verdicts that matched the evidence, sentences that matched the crimes, and a record that would stand as one of the defining achievements of the FBI Chicago Field Office's organized crime program. The Chicago outfit, diminished by decades of federal prosecution and the demographic erosion of the ethnic neighborhood structures that had sustained it, absorbed the blow. The organization that had endured Capone and the Kefauver hearings and the Chicago 7 and a generation of prior RICO cases had now lost its acting boss, its consigliere, and one of its most dangerous soldiers, all of them sent to prison for life, all of them convicted in large part on the voice of a man talking freely to his son in a prison yard, not knowing that everything he said was being recorded and that his son had already made the decision that would define both of their lives. The letter Frank Calabrese Jr. wrote to the FBI became, in retrospect, the instrument that did what 30 years of organized crime investigation in Chicago had never quite managed. It opened the outfit from the inside, in a man's own words, on tape, in a case that held. Judge Zagel's sentences, imposed in the early months of 2009, reflected the magnitude of what had been uncovered. Life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole, for the men who had sat at the top of an organization built on the understanding that loyalty and silence were the only currencies that mattered, and that blood, familial blood, the blood of the organization's enemies, the blood of anyone who threatened the enterprise, was the ultimate enforcer of both. The prison yard conversations that Frank Calabrese Sr. had believed were private had become the foundation of a federal case that reached further into the Chicago outfit than anything that had come before it. The son had listened to his father, the father had talked, and the FBI had been there to record every word.